Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Sarah Martin. I'm an HR consultant and one of the directors of NQHR. Before we get started today, I've just got a few quick things I just wanted to cover off. The session today is going to run until 10 a.m. and we'll aim to leave 5 or so minutes at the end to cover the Q&A. So as Tamar said, if you've got any questions, then please do feel free to put those into the Q&A box. Our next HR Club, just a date for your diaries, is on the 5th of December. In that session, we're going to be looking at the new duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, which comes in at the end of October. That will be a joint session between us and one of the employment lawyers at VWV, so we can cover both the HR and legal aspects. On to today's session, I am delighted to welcome Jane. Jane is joining us today to talk to you about developing a reward strategy. Sorry, a reward strategy. Jane is an HR professional and self-confessed geek who likes working with numbers. She is an MCIPD qualified pay and reward specialist and has almost 20 years experience of, and I love the simplicity of this phrase, making salary structures work. Jane's worked in a variety of different sectors, including aerospace, utilities, construction, education, housing and social care, media and manufacturing. I've had the benefit of hearing Jane deliver some of this session before, and like all really good subject matter experts, she is brilliant at explaining things in plain English. I know that Jane wanted to make sure that everyone attending today had something useful to take away with them, and she's developed the session with that in mind. So without any further delay, I will hand over to Jane.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. Much appreciated. It's always interesting to and gratifying to hear somebody say that I speak in a plain English way, because I think one of the biggest things we do with our language is confuse it and get people to the point where that we use such highbrow language they don't always understand what we're talking about. And I think one of the terms in all of that that causes that is when we use terms like strategy. I quite often talk strategy in organisations, and I can see the shoulders going up around the room as people go, oh God, she's going to talk strategy. And I know fine well that that's not actually what we aim to achieve. What we're trying to do is put people in a position where they have a plan, and a long-term plan rather than just a series of short-term actions. And reward strategy is no different in that respect. When we're looking at a reward strategy, we're considering key and important things like what are the business benefits of having a reward strategy, and we're looking at things like all the phrases that we are seeing commonly used in organizations these days. So employee empowerment, what are we going to do to give people that feeling that they have some part and some control in all of this? And commitment to employees, we expect staff who join us to commit to us. What are we committing to with them? And putting ourselves and our employees in a better position to respond to uncertainty and change, because let's face it, the reality is that we are never not in a position of uncertainty and change. I used to describe working in HR like the 3 peaks challenge. Once you got over one peak, you were always going to get to another one, and it was just continuous, and that hasn't changed in 20 years. So there we go. And then the biggest thing that we need to do, and this is what I am all about when I'm looking at strategy, is ensuring that we have support for the long-term business strategy. Developing strategy is great, but if it doesn't align to the business plan, it isn't going to work for us. One of the questions that people often ask me is, what do we mean by strategy, and what's a reward strategy? And I think CIPD are great because they give us definitions for everything, and that's really useful. And their definition for reward strategy, to design, implement reward policies and practices to support and advance your organisational objectives. And this is all about, what are we trying to achieve as an organization. Really, really important that we get to the point where the business looks at everything we're doing with reward and says, that fits our needs. This is what we're aiming for. It's pushing us in the right direction. And so people get quite nervous about developing the strategy around that, but actually what I'm hoping to do today is put you in a position where you do this with the feeling of confidence around what you need to do. As made Sarah laugh, and I said, there's nothing worse, in my view, than attending a session and somebody talks all about the topic, and then at the end of it, you walk away thinking, that's great, but what do I do next? I'm actually going to start you on the do next path, hopefully. So let's see how we go with this. So the reward strategy, design and implementation of reward policies and practices to support and advance your organizational objectives. And what does it cover? Well, it covers the entirety, and I'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a minute. But the first thing, of course, is your pay structure and your pay structure and reward framework and pay progression and how that works as an organization for you. And then there's things like market alignment. Where are we going to fit as an organization? How do we compare to our key competitors? Who are our key competitors? What do they look like? Do we get the right information, the information we need to be comfortable that we are going to be able to compete with these people? And things like recognition and bonus and incentives, and how does that match with our pay structure and our progression and our market alignment? It's all kind of absolutely tied in together. You can't do one thing without doing the rest of it. So it's really important that we have this connection. And then, of course, the one thing that everybody seems to think that report is all about and is just about is the compliance and the fairness and equity in the reporting. And these are important things, of course they are, but we're not just about that. There was somebody yesterday who said that they hadn't realised or hadn't thought about the fact that reward underpins every activity that HR does, and therefore every activity, hopefully, that the business is doing. And now they'd spoken to me a bit more about what was included in a reward strategy, they felt that they got that better than they did before. Reporting, though, isn't just about legislative compliance. It's not just about the gender pay gap or equal pay position. There's so much more you can do. I don't normally plug books and things, but I think one of the things that we're not really good in HR, and I've worked both in-house and with many organizations, and I get this, is identifying what our key performance indicators are. And I think there was an article put on by, let me just check the name, make sure I've got it right, Rob O'Brien, who's a professional organisation. It's a Dave Ulrich article, and that's got KPIs for HR in it. And if anybody wants a copy of that, then give me a shout. But things like measuring things like salary competitive ratio, percentage of labour cost, benefit satisfaction, all of these sorts of things must become part of our strategy and our reporting so that we can see how we're progressing as organisations. There's another book, the FT are great at producing business books that's really helpful, and a chap called Bernard Marr created a book called Key Performance Indicators. It's got 75 indicators in it. Somebody like me who's a bit of a geek about numbers, wow, I mean, I flicked through every last one of those indicators to understand what they were about. The book tells you what the indicator is, it tells you what information you need to measure it, and it tells you what the output of that might look like. So I think, understanding what key performance indicators you need and will work for your business is going to be one of the activities that you will need to cover when developing your strategy. But all of these things hang together and they're all interconnected. And the reason I presented it as the way I did was just that constant reminder that they're all changing as well. They're never going to be set in stone. It's a big problem for us in HR because we're dealing with people and we're dealing with strategies and we're dealing with change and moving the business forward all the time. Nothing stays the same. People are an organic mass, and you bring in one new one and take one old one out, and you've changed what you've got, and you've changed the future of what you've got. So you've got to be constantly on board with checking and sense checking what your strategy is doing, how it's working for you, and what that might look like. So when we think about that, then we're thinking about, how does our strategy link to our employer value proposition? Now, we have this a lot cropping up with EVP. I see it everywhere as kind of, what is our EVP? Our EVP is this, our EVP is that. What are we trying to achieve through our EVP? And it's really important that we know what it is, that the reward link for the EVP. And now we know that it's a psychological contract between employee and employer. And we know it's about the benefits and rewards, the return for skills and capabilities and performance. And in the image here, and we will send the slides out afterwards, you can see that it's, your pay framework, your bonus and recognition, your benefits, your career development, your home and personal goals. And I think there's quite a lot of information in there that we need to take on board about our staff and our employees when we're building our employee value proposition, but we also need to use to help support our strategy. The next slide is one that it looks very busy, but I put it in deliberately because we all have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all know that there's already a lot of information out there about what people are expecting at work. And I think we very rarely actually stop and look at our EVP and ensure that it matches with that hierarchy of needs, that we are delivering the recognised picture and how it all fits together. I think sometimes the hierarchy of needs is the one thing that I walk into a room with senior managers and they all have seen it before. So that's one of the reasons I use this to help explain what a reward strategy is going to be looking at and delivering, and what that means for the organisation. Because managers sometimes lose sight of the fact that pay frameworks, bonus recognition, benefits, career development, home and personal goals all drive expectations that staff have when they work for us, and all put us in a position where we need to ensure that we are focusing on the needs of our staff. It's really tough. There's a lot of information we have to take on board, and I'm going to kind of help you through the process of gathering what that information might look like. How do I do that gathering? I use this a lot with clients. I'm going in and I'm looking for information to build a strategy, and building that strategy, for me, it's a kind of structured process. I'm all about numbers, processes. I'm a reward person. I'm really sorry. It's just what we do. We've always been that way. Every reward person I've met likes process and numbers. And having a process, of course, is a great way to start off if you don't know what to do. And what we need to get to is really understanding what our strategic principles are and what that means. So I start with a process of asking myself, I use this table actually, and I build on it, but what information do we need? Who needs to provide it and be involved in the process of providing that information? Key stakeholders. And what questions do I need to ask? And these questions are fundamental to getting to the bottom of what your strategy is going to look like. Now, there are 3 elements up there, but I have 9 that I go in and collect. And if I show you here, alignment to business plan. And the first thing I say is, don't panic. Everybody thinks, well, they've either got a business plan or it's in somebody's head. It doesn't matter if it's somebody's head. If it is in somebody's head, ask them what their top 5 priorities are for the business, because that will help you to understand what alignment to your business plan might look like. And then the things that in HR, we are always concerned about, we have, vision statements, mission statements, culture, behaviors, and all these sorts of things, usually mapped out either as a team or across a business. We know what sort of culture we're trying to achieve, and we need to understand how our reward strategy is going to fit with that culture. And I'll give you a couple of hints about that in a minute. And the behavioral impact, what outcomes do we want? And an example of behavioral impact, I think, is thinking about things in our reward strategy, like if we state to our staff that we are that we are a caring and supportive organization, we need to make sure that we have things in place that prove that. And quite often, statutory sick pay is not going to be your driver for showing staff that you're a caring organisation, and it will impact on the behaviours that you get. Statutory sick pay directly impacts on behaviours that you get from staff. There are of course, many different benefits, terms, pays and things that can do that. The other things that I ask about specifically are what's the business trying to achieve with its reward strategy? What outcomes do the stakeholders expect to see? Not what I want to see, but what the stakeholders are expecting to see. And sometimes these come as a surprise. I did one recently where the management team in the room together were actually saying, well, we want to deliver a culture where we have skilled employees and maybe less of those in place of the raft of employees we've got who aren't necessarily as skilled as they should be. And the CEO was a little bit, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting to hear that. It came as a bit of a surprise to him, but then that was, when we talked about it further, it was clear that, the skills base and the talent base wasn't in a position to deliver the strategy. They needed to move it forward to ensure that it did. Things to think about also: lines of authority, sort of who you're going to delegate budget approval to, who you're going to delegate awards to, who has control of the progression and things like that. Links to budgets, again, who owns the budget? I know finance own the budget, but actually in a lot of organizations, finance set the budget and managers own the budget. So it's about working out what those links are, how increases are going to be applied. These are all things that we're going to need to understand in our principles. And then back to our market alignment and our links to recognition. Now, if I go back to those strategic principles questions and think about just alignment to your business plan. As I said, don't panic if you haven't got a whole plan. What are the first top 5 priorities, or even 6 or 7 if you've got 6 or 7? What are those key priorities? Which stakeholders do you need to talk to understand what it means for them? And what questions are you going to ask? I ask questions like, will it be driven by your performance outcomes? Will it be cascading targets and performance scores that drive decisions? Will it be wholly separate, i.e. based on time served or skills and competence based? And there are things that when we put the reward framework together, we do it quite often based on what people see as best practice, but actually best practice doesn't always drive your business. You need to make sure that what you're putting in place supports your business plan. So you need to understand what the expectations are of the business, and also what success looks like to them, not to you, but to them. What do they see success looking like from their perspective? And for culture fit, what sort of culture do you have, and how are you going to maintain it using a reward framework? There's, back to this, I said about caring culture. If you're maintaining that your culture is one of care and support for your staff, if you maintain that your culture is engaging and inclusive, are your reward practices going to be engaging and inclusive? How can you make sure that they maintain that culture? As a hint here, individual performance bonuses don't necessarily drive engaging and inclusive behaviour, especially in some sectors like financial services and things like that. You've got to be aware of the mentality behind the activity that you're putting in place and what that will mean. Will it drive the performance and behaviours that you want out of it? Will your culture be maintained? If you have a culture where you want to drive innovative behaviour, but your reward framework rewards people for long service, are they actually going to be innovative if the long service framework is just rewarding them anyway? And again, that behavioural impact. Do you want team behaviours? Do you want to focus on specific values? Culture change is a really big thing, but what are those values that underpin that culture change, and how are you going to connect into those with your reward framework? What questions are you going to need to ask the business to find that out? So I've given you an example of the questions I'm going to ask, and now I'm going to give you a task. And my task is for you to take 15-20 minutes now, and we're going to leave you, we'll give you 15 minutes now, leave you to have a look at this table, look at those first 3 items, and make a note of who needs to provide the information to you, where will you get it, who are your key stakeholders, and brainstorm, just while you've got this peace and quiet time, what questions you need to ask. Because I think if you get started on that process, you're more likely to complete it. That's point number 1 from my perspective of this. And also, there's nothing worse than doing a session like this, coming away with nothing. This gives you opportunity to take the time that you've got now and work and create something productive out of it. So enjoy the opportunity to have the chance to do some thinking, and we will come back in 15 minutes, if that's okay. So sort of 22, quarter to, we'll say 22, and then we'll start back again at quarter to, ensuring that we've got everybody back in the room. So enjoy your session. Okay, so I think Sarah is going to be coming back to join us in just a moment as well. Hi, Sarah. Just to having given you the opportunity to think through some of those key questions, I would be curious, and I don't know if people could do this, but if anybody's used AI to help them come up with those questions, could they just pop it in the chat? Because I'm curious to know how many people are using AI to support them in their HR endeavors. And also, you know, did it give you any really good questions where you thought, wow, I wouldn't have thought of asking that? And if you want to just see it again, just a reminder that the strategic principles that we are looking at are all aligned to the business plan, culture fit, behavioural impact, outcomes required, lines of authority, the link to the budget, what sort of increases and how they're going to be applied, our market alignment and our link to recognition. And these are all things that we need to understand what the business thinks about them and how we are going to improve them if we're going to align everything to our strategic goals as an organisation. Now is the time for us to take feedback and maybe have a discussion. Did anybody have any feedback about the questions that they've come up with? If so, perhaps you could raise your hand.
I don't know that we'll be able to see raised hands,
Oh,
but
damn.
I can keep an eye on the. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A box and the chat box. It doesn't look as if nobody's posted to say that they used AI in formulating any of their draft questions. Hopefully everybody has seen has got the links, by the way, to the links to the first one, and I've provided a way to access the Rob Reiner and Dave Ulrich article
yeah.
that Jane referred to at the start.
Yeah.
Has anybody got any feedback on the task, whether it was easier than you expected, harder, whether you have got what you feel like is a start in terms of asking some of those questions? In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions, Jane.
Yeah.
Might warm people up a little bit if I know it's sometimes a bit daunting. Oh, not quite on the poll, Tamar, as yet. I was thinking, in practical terms, if you're asked to do a project like this,
Yeah.
what are the typical, and I know it will vary from project to project, but what are the typical timescales you might be looking at? And I suppose that's both in terms of the beginning and end, the length of time it can take from the actual kickoff to the end of having a nice, shiny new reward strategy, and also your time in terms of input into that, because I appreciate it's not going to be the same. You'll
No.
be probably dipping in and out of a project as it goes on, and you will be asking questions, and there'll be some information gathering that clients go away and do.
Yeah. So if we have a really good set of business plan and information up front about the organisation and type of culture it is, it can literally be a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. But if we're going to go through and have all these discussions with managers, so then it can take 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how quickly we can get discussions scheduled in. My time is usually spent collating all of that information, which can take a couple of weeks, depending on how much information we've been provided with, and recognizing and understanding the trends and the patterns in it. And we usually aim to feed that back within 10 working days of what we've received. So it is a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, because it depends how much useful information is available up front. We have we call it a strategic intentions questionnaire that we send out with clients, and they can send that out to their managers. And depending on the type of organisation, I either get it back already collated, or sometimes I just get it back in anonymous format. It's entirely dependent on the organisation and the kind of change it's hoping to achieve. So,
okay. I've had a couple of questions in. Should the questions be forward facing only? So, for example, what's needed going forward linked to business strategy? Or do you also look back and do a bit of an assessment of what's worked well or what doesn't work very well with current pay and reward?
I like to ask those questions. I like to find out directly what managers like and dislike about the whole reward framework and what's going on with it at this moment in time. Because if you understand that, then when you're making changes, you can bear in mind what they dislike and what you really need to avoid in order to keep your business comfortable with your strategy going forward. So yeah, I think look forward in terms of what are we trying to achieve, but look back in terms of what have we got and how is it working. So it's a bit of both.
Okay. Yeah. Someone else saying they enjoyed the opportunity. A couple of people said they enjoyed the opportunity to consider the questions to be asked. The next question is about how do you get buy-in from senior leaders to do a piece of work like this? If there is resistance perhaps to embarking on this kind of project or fully kind of engaging in the sort of questioning process, have you got any tips for people on how to overcome that?
Yeah, a really difficult one. Usually managers are engaged because they're being asked questions that engage them. Being given the opportunity to give their views and their thoughts is, we don't always give them those opportunities. Buy-in is about helping them to understand that in order to ensure that you deliver a successful strategy that supports everything they are trying to achieve, you need to understand the answers to those questions and make sure that what you're putting in place drives the results for them. So this is about working together as a team, you and them, to deliver the outcomes that they want, rather than just handing you a piece of work and say going away and doing it without you having sufficient information to do it. So yeah, I think sometimes there's a bit of resistance, but I think that's about time, and usually about the I don't want to answer this question now because I haven't had a chance to think about it. And maybe giving them questions in advance and allowing them to answer them remotely will start the process and get them engaged with you.
Yeah. And some organisations won't have performance related pay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sort of ideas for reward in those sort of scenarios?
Okay, yeah. Performance related pay, a lot of organisations don't have it. I think there are plenty of pay structures. I say this a lot, and other people might have heard me say it before, but there are only about 9 ways of paying people in pay structures, and linking performance to those ways of paying people is a choice business makes. And if you don't link it, if you're just paying people for the job they do and there's some career progression in there, that's just part of your salary framework. Career progression is about identifying whether somebody's ready for the next stages. There are frameworks that that are time served, or what's the word for, skills and acquisition based as well. So it's about finding the right one for you as an organization and applying it, but it doesn't always have to be linked to performance. Performance based pay is a distinct way of paying people, as opposed to whether other ways which are linked to all the other different elements of. And if I'm trying to think of a really good example, and I think if you take if you look at pay structures, what we tend to see are bands, and then we tend to see progression through the bands steps, and that isn't necessarily linked to performance. That might be linked to just an annual pay review, and we say at year 1 you come in at level 1, and then there's 5 levels and you go up a level each year, and then when you get to the top you're going to stay there for the rest of your career, unless you change careers and whatever and move into a different post. So yeah, it's about just identifying. Pay doesn't have to be linked to performance. And performance is great. You can recognize performance through bonuses, separate bonus schemes. You can recognize performance through recognition schemes. There's endless ways of recognizing performance, including just saying thank you. But at the end of the day, it's about identifying what works for you.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, that someone's asked a question, and I've sort of got a bit of a link question. But so I suppose that the question that's been asked is, what are your recommendations for managing expectations and challenges of managing pay and reward in third sector organisations, or where budgets are really tight?
Whoa. The first thing I would say is be honest with staff. I think there's nothing worse than managers telling staff or the business telling staff that things are looking good and we're going to give you a pay rise when the budget's really, really tight. So be clear about what drivers you have for pay awards and pay increases, and that budget, absolutely available budget, is one of them. And what makes budget available? So what has the business got to do to improve that position as a whole? And then kind of putting in place frameworks for them to understand how the business is performing. I think we're very bad at communicating how our businesses are doing with staff, and some of these key management ratios and things can be presented in really simple ways to help staff see that the impact that the pay bill and stuff is having on the business.
Yeah, I guess it's that challenge, isn't it, about not wanting to well, I think probably there is a sort of, I don't know, a reluctance sometimes. I'm not quite sure where it comes from to share that kind of information. Perhaps it comes from a place of wanting to shield or protect um,
Yeah,
employees, but also that transparency being quite important in terms of getting people on board with
yeah,
understanding what's available. My sort of link question was, budgets are tight out there. We know that. In you talked about everything sort of being connected, and it's hard to look at one thing without unpacking the whole piece. And I suppose my question or sort of challenge to that, I guess, is in your view, are there any kind of quick wins? Are there any or is it better just to sort of go, okay, this is not something we can do piecemeal, or there aren't really any kind of quick wins. We just need to sort of invest the time and budget in doing this properly.
I think my view, the biggest quick win you have is communication. Absolutely. And telling staff and reminding them of what you give them in return for them coming in to work every day. So when we're not really good, or not always really good at telling staff what they get in terms of their pay and employment package and what that looks like. So, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of total reward statements. I think they're great to an extent, but they need to be very, very carefully presented, but telling people that all the other things you give them as well as pay, especially when budgets are tight, reminding them about the other things that they get from you is more difficult if you're very statutory oriented. But if you're doing things that are above statutory entitlement, tell them. If you're doing great things with culture and behavior, keep reminding them that all of this is part of that holistic reward package, and it's part of the whole strategic HR and the EVP. So just, yeah, communication in my view. I hear quite often I've told them 100 times, but actually, if they haven't heard you once, you haven't communicated. So think about telling people in different ways as well.
Yeah, someone else echoing that. Yeah, so the earlier question of buy-in from stakeholders, sometimes senior decision makers can see a reward strategy as forcing them to let go of the autonomy and flexibility they have to make individual remuneration decisions. Yeah, have you got any
Yeah,
comments?
I have quite a strong view on this. It's probably good, but my view is that if they are part of a senior management team or part of a senior leadership team, they should all be working together. So the decisions that they take should be across the business, not just for their part of the business. So if that's the case, then they need to understand the wider business impact of the decisions they're making, and having a framework against which they can make those decisions will help. If you've got strategic principles in your reward strategy that are applied consistently, you will get a better outcome and better decisions made.
And I
So
guess it reduces risk as
yeah,
well in terms of
yeah,
challenge and possible claims.
yeah.
So if I'm sat listening to your session this morning and thinking, okay, is this something we need to sort of think about? In your experience, when clients come to you, are there any particular sort of red flags or triggers that you find will often prompt an organization to go, okay, right, we need to look at this?
Yeah. Usually the biggest trigger is feedback from an engagement survey about the data they've got back. If there are reward or HR questions in there, there's usually triggers in there that say, we're not happy, or you've got high turnover that is directly related to pay, and they're not just saying it's pay, if you know what I mean. Sometimes they say it's pay because it's easier. But actually, if you've done an employment survey, that's usually when we get involved by companies who've done surveys and say, this is really difficult for us. We've got these answers. How do we address it? And or if actually it's something that you haven't looked at but you just feel uncomfortable with? I mean, in my experience, the people who are looking at this usually have a sense of we're not quite comfortable that it all hangs together. And that's
Yeah.
a real, if you're not, it's probably time to start thinking about how to make sure that it does hang together.
Okay. Somebody's asked a question that's quite specific about support staff in schools. I think with that one, if you drop me or Jane a line after the session today, I wonder if that's something that we could pick up separately after the session, because I suspect there might be quite a lot to unpick in terms of thinking that through. I think we've covered all of the oh, we've got one more question here. Okay, so I find there's increasing pressure on businesses to be transparent with, this will be the last question I think we've got time for,
Yeah,
with reward
yeah.
and remuneration, especially from younger generations coming through. Do you have any advice about finding the balance between retaining discretion and room for negotiation and being transparent with staff?
Oh, absolutely. And I feel quite strongly about this one. Transparency isn't about publishing individual pay rates. Transparency is having good processes and decision-making processes around how you get to the salary for an individual. So you don't have to share what every individual is on. You just have to give people confidence that the decisions you have made to get to those pay rates have been done in a fair and transparent way. So your processes are shared with people so they understand what the processes are and what they mean. So if you're doing salary benchmarking, be clear about the fact that you use salary benchmarking as part of the process. If you're developing a framework, who was involved in developing that framework? Have you used staff groups to support you? Those sorts of information all supports your transparent approach without actually giving everybody their salaries. But yeah,
Thank
you
you.
can't stop people talking about salaries. Younger people particularly share every element of their life, including salaries.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay.
I hope everyone found that useful. I certainly found it really useful. We've got a couple of polls, and it's sort of it's almost like Jane knew because she talked about staff engagement surveys being a sort of prompt sometimes for her to get involved and help organisations. And so one of the things we've been thinking about as within NQHR is the sort of role of engagement surveys, and we're just sort of we're always kind of looking at and thinking about what our clients are doing. And one of the things we wanted to just ask a couple of quick polls about at the end of the session today was a little bit about that. So if you've got time, I appreciate we're slightly over and want to that Tamar will share a couple of polls at the end of the session, and we may well also be able to, although I can't 100% promise, be able to share the results of these on our follow-up, which I think would probably be helpful for everybody to see. And there will also be a feedback slide that will pop up at the end. So if you do have the opportunity to fill that in, that would be much appreciated. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming along. We hope you find it useful and hope to see you at our next session.